Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Josh Downs. I'm SVP here at LSX and delighted to be hosting today's webinar in partnership with DFIN, Donnelley Financial Solutions. As with our previous webinars, we have a lot of familiar faces on as attendees today, but also a number of new faces. So very briefly, an intro to LSX while we wait for people to join. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We're a community and network of life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, and health tech businesses, pharma companies, the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as some payers, providers, and other key stakeholders in the healthcare space. Many people know us from our high-level, large-scale conference and partnering events and showcases that we run in Europe. And a core one of these is our Investable Showcase, which we run in London in November. This webinar is kicking us off in our campaign of building towards November, which we work in partnership with Jefferies, and Gil is one of our partners and speakers today for their healthcare conference across the 15th and 17th of November, with our Investable Showcase on the 14th of November. And delighted that our entire panel today is involved in some way for that event in November, and hope to be able to see a number of you on the webinar today in person when we get to them. Just to allow another minute or two to allow any latecomers to join before I hand over to Ross from DFIN, who's going to be moderating and leading today's session. A couple of quick points to make sure that we have a smooth webinar, and a couple of quick housekeeping points. We will be running through the panel session first, but we will have the opportunity at the end for you to ask your questions, which you can do so throughout via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you have a tab. So if you do have a question throughout or at the end as we come to the Q&A section, please do post that question in there. You can post it in the chat function, but it's a lot more efficient to keep it in the Q&A function. If you see a question that you'd also like answered, you have the opportunity to upvote that question. So please do use that if you want to make sure that that question is answered first and foremost. If you have any other questions or issues, please do message me privately via the chat function as well. But otherwise, delighted to hand over to Ross Johnson with DFIN to lead us through and introduce the panel. So Ross, over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon for our webinar on how to navigate your late-stage biotech fundraising in the current economic climate. We have a fantastic panel this afternoon. As a way of introduction, my name is Ross Johnson. I'm a managing director at DFIN, Donnelley Financial Solutions. I'll leave the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. Robbie, should we start with you?
Yeah, of course. Hi, Ross, and hi to the rest of the panelists. Hello to all the attendees. I'm Robbie Mclaren, partner at Latham and Watkins here in London. And I work on M&A and venture capital financings for UK and European life sciences companies. Nice to be here this afternoon.
And Hsin, shall we go to you next?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Hsin Loke, VP of Finance and Operations at OMass Therapeutics. So I lead the non-scientific functions for OMass, which is a small molecule drug discovery company. I'll tell you a little bit about OMass in a minute. So I joined OMass 4 years ago when it was 5 people, and we've just completed our Series B, which is kind of what I have to contribute a little bit here. And yeah, so I've got a scientific background, but then spent most of my career at GSK working in various finance, strategy, and operational roles. So OMass, is this a good time to say a few words about OMass?
We'll come back to that when we've done the intros.
Okay, all right.
Jennifer, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Hi, everyone. So like Robbie, I'm a partner in the US Capital Markets Group at Latham in London. My practice typically focuses on listings in the United States, so both European companies outside of the US going into the US, and that includes biotechs and various industries, but great to be here.
And Gil, over to you.
Hi. Thanks, Ross. glad to be here and continuing our partnerships with the LSX team. I'm Dr. Bar Nahum, Managing Director of the Jefferies London team. I run the biotech business for us here out of London. Last decade plus living here in Europe, I've helped over 50 companies access the US capital markets through initial public offerings, and spent a good amount of my time thinking about private into public, spent a good amount of my time also the developmental biotech side of the planet. So I've been a banker for over 20 years, and I'm also a scientist by training.
Thanks, Gil, and to the rest of the panel. Hsin, I'm going to come back to you. OMass Therapeutics announced the closing of a $100 million Series B in April of this year. Great round, congratulations. Please tell us a little bit more about OMass, but also thinking about that round, what were the key considerations for the round, plan, amount, target investors, structure, etc. And what were the challenges, pain points? What did you face during the process?
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions all in one go. So maybe I'll take them bit by bit, and I have to prompt me to finish the exam questions to get to the end. So a little bit about OMass first. We spun out of Oxford University. We're based at the Oxford Science Park. The company originated from technology, native mass spec research that's been pioneered and basically then commercialized by Professor Dame Carol Robinson. And really it's the company for the last 4 years with seed funding and Series A has been to industrialize sort of high-end academic native mass spec into a drug screening capability. So we have a proprietary platform, Audition, that now integrates novel biochemistry, native mass spectrometry, also custom chemistry, to allow us to study protein complex interactions and use that to basically screen small molecule therapeutics. So in the last few years, we've built up an early stage portfolio. And really, this is kind of completely part of the plan. It was supported by blue chip UK investors in the past. We're supported by Syncona and Oxford Science Enterprise. I think now they're called OSE or Ox Sciences, no matter how you want to cut their name. They've been strong supporters for the last few years. And so, really the next stage of growth that we're entering now, and part of the plan with the Series B really is to grow various different aspects of the company. First of all, clearly kind of mature our portfolio, increase the portfolio. And then from an investor and plan perspective, continue to get strong support from our current UK investors, but increase the investor base and portfolio overseas. So we've managed to attract US investors. That was part of the plan, to begin to raise our profile internationally. And to progress the portfolio to reach clinical stage next, and increase capability, of course. So we're in a science park in quite a small office today. We're kind of a little bit short of desks, hot desking today. We want to move to a new site and continue to grow our capabilities from drug discovery into preclinical and eventually clinical capabilities. I think that was the first part of your question. The next part was talking about the sort of key considerations. So I think in terms of the plan, I mean, we set out, I guess, starting from, so where does it all start, right? It starts with the story and the prep work, being really, really clear about that. The narrative took, I would say, 6 to 9 months to build. And in building that, clarifying exactly what our differentiation is, what the plan is for the next few years, and that anchors the business plan, the portfolio, and ultimately the plan. The money goes with the plan, right? That gives us a really clear idea of what money we're trying to raise, and what kind of profile our capabilities we're trying to build. That's probably the first step. And then kind of building from there. I don't know whether you want to explore more about the plan, how you want to set this out.
I'm sort of interested, but we can welcome some of the other panel in on this, but planning and preparation, I'm really interested in, the planning and preparation required to maximize a successful raise. And it'd be good for the panel to talk us through what they feel are the main considerations here, how they feel, you can best plan going through, you're gearing up for your next fundraise and how that might be the pathway to the next one. And maybe Gil, it'd be a good opportunity for you to talk about that and what you see.
Sure. Thanks, Ross. I think in terms of broadly what's going on in the private market, unfortunately, there's a massive ceiling that's been put on, and I think the late stage pre-IPO space has really dried up pretty significantly. A lot of that has to do with, I think the latest statistic I saw was 87% of all the IPOs in 2020 are trading below issue. And I think it's something like 92% of all the IPOs in 2021 are trading below issue. And it's not just that they're off $1 or $2 a share. Some of these $16 share prices are sitting at $2, $3 a share. So when you have this massive devaluation of recently IPO'd companies that are trading sub 100 million market cap, that's essentially going to put a real ceiling on the private company valuations or even interest in such private companies, because 100 million market cap company that's traded and is liquid and I could go and buy the stock and go ahead and trade it if I want to is clearly much more attractive in this overall volatile environment than a $100 million valuation for a private company with a similar risk profile. And until we see some of these public company valuations buoy back up, that's going to put a real ceiling and really keep the IPO market relatively shut. Now, there are certain situations where amazing data trumps all. I'd say that the goalposts on what was amazing data a few years back to what is amazing data today is very, very different. A few years back, folks would get extremely excited about 6 or 7 mice in an oncology study, and maybe you'd get a $500 to $1 billion valuation, depending on how long your mice survive. Today, that's a really highly controlled phase 3 event, a phase 2 event with open label data, 3-4 patients that show a real good response that used to enable a significant financing event. Today, investors want to see monotherapy, investors want to see long duration, investors want to see really good safety. And they want to make sure that you're able to manufacture the product along all those. So all of those hurdles did not really exist in the conversations that we had before, but the risk tolerance has really, really decreased. The velocity of capital has really, really dried up. And it's become really, really challenging to get public companies the financing that they need. That being said, I think things are seemingly trying to move in the right direction. There were a few transactions that we were able to execute last week. The week before that, there were a few other transactions. I think the real problem remains that none of these transactions in the public landscape are actually performing quite well. In 19, 18, 17, if you bought every IPO that year and you sold at December 31st, you were almost guaranteed to get an 80, 100% return on all of your money. That type of outsized return for such an asset class brought a ton of investors into the space. And then when the music stops, everybody loses a lot of money. So where we were in February of last year to where we are today is a massive devaluation that's also come across with a big kind of growth to value transition in conjunction with inflation, in conjunction with everybody kind of getting out of biotech. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, unfortunately, for the private landscape. I'd say that while that part of the market seems to be a bit shut, on the earlier side of the table, the early stage companies, the Series A, the venture, the Series B, that still seems to be a functional marketplace where there's a long horizon. Those VCs that play in that space still have a good amount of capital and are still deploying capital. It's that kind of in-between space where why should I buy this pre-IPO company when I can get the same risk and liquidity in the public market? So until we see that kind of equilibration of values, it's gonna put a little bit of a ceiling on the IPOs. And until the IPOs start coming forward, the pre-IPO market will begin to, obviously, hopefully show a little bit more light. But where we stand today is about 180 degrees from where we were, let's say 12 months ago, unfortunately. Maybe 18 months ago, sorry.
I mean, and I've got obviously lots of pressure coming down from the public markets, not performing, and then obviously that affecting private valuations. I mean, I've got a question on that front for Robbie and Jennifer in terms of deal structures, term sheets. Are we seeing There's lots of narrative around, obviously, founder-friendly terms, and I mean, that now moving towards VCs and investors and their mindset being a lot more conservative. Are we seeing deal structures, term sheets change due to the present market? Are we seeing a shift in terms of how investors are approaching this?
Why don't I kick this one off, Jen, unless you have a desire to go for it?
No, go ahead.
Look, I think, and I think just reflecting on what Hsin and Gil have said, which is, as Gil particularly focused on is, you got a bit of data that you went public and everyone thought you were a kind of hero at the time. And that story has very much changed. And I think when we were preparing for this session, I think one of the key things that resonated with me that came out of the conversation we had with Hsin was around knowing what your plan is now is so critical. It's not just we have some data, we will therefore go public. It's now, what is your plan for the money that you want to raise? Knowing exactly who it is you're going to raise that from, because, just because you have some data doesn't mean you can do a kind of a pre-IPO crossover or whatever you want to categorize it as anymore. So you don't want to be casting as such wide a net because your pre-IPO financiers are just not going to be interested if you're too early. So you need to be a bit more structured as to who you approach and for how much and for why, and then understanding what your pathway is to the next stage. I think in terms of structuring, I think what we're seeing is that, and Hsin, again, congrats on OMass on raising. I mean, you can't imagine what you'd have raised last year, but raising $100 million this year is just a sensational achievement. But I think what I'm seeing now in terms of term sheets is more structured investments where capital is being deployed relative to milestones. So yes, there's a bunch of cash that's coming in, and then there will be a commitment to follow-on money. So you might raise $50 million, but you're only getting 25 on the day you close, and then there's a validation point at some point over the next, not too long term, 3 to 6 months usually, where you will get the rest of the capital. And that just kind of reflects, I suppose, from my perspective, the risk off appetite, but also reflects the kind of knowing your pathway discussion. So we're seeing a lot of that.
On that note, and a question for you, Hsin, I mean, how mindful were you during your Series B round of the pathway to the next round? And looking at that also from an investor perspective in terms of picking up on what Robbie said, I mean, how targeted were you in advance with respect to who you wanted your investors to be? And how did you approach that?
Yeah, no, I think, you could probably see me nodding when Robbie was speaking, and certainly, although we did close this year, clearly the process is quite a long kind of planful process, right? It started off, I would probably think 9 months before we even got to April, starting with not just the internal prep work. So a lot of my role was making sure our housekeeping was in order so that as soon as we're ready to go, we're ready to go. All the paperwork. You want to make due diligence easy, right? You want to be able to answer questions as soon as possible. And that prep work starts, from the day, I guess, the company starts, right? But in terms of investors, it was a very planful process and discussion with the board. What is the plan? Is it crossover or is it Series B? And there were lots of discussions because the market did change during the time we were having those conversations. And then I would say that Roz and Ali, our CEO and CSO, would have spent a lot of time meeting different people and lining them up. This kind of mapping out all your investors in a great big long list. Who on the board knows who can make introductions, so that all those discussions are very targeted and structured. And then getting advice. We spoke to banks, legal advisors, other companies to get input and introductions. So it was a very structured process and very planful. So it was very clear what we were trying to achieve, and being very kind of clear about what we were asking. Right? So reflecting what Robbie just said.
Yeah, and Robbie and Jennifer, you mentioned it, or Robbie, you mentioned it, and Hsin, you also mentioned it in terms of milestones. And then I'm interested in terms of, how the panel, what advice the panel would have, to a biotech company when they're looking to plan around key milestones when it comes to fundraising, and how they, what your advice would be in terms of how they approach that.
I mean, I think as I was scouting around internally at Latham about asking any hot topics that we were seeing across the globe on this topic, and two of my hilarious partners said the key thing you need to be as a biotech at the moment is valuation intolerant. You just need to, whenever and however you can raise capital, you should be really thinking about it very, very carefully. If you don't have a plan for where to get your money from, right? Which is if you need more capital to get to your pathway. And that is why the structured options are coming up. I think, and maybe this one for the pass over to Jenna, is what you do need to do is have that pathway, but don't lose sight of, I suppose, ultimately go. I'm a massive optimist, so the market will open eventually, and biotech IPOs are getting done, as Gil mentioned. And it is, Hsin said, it's a 9-month process to get ready just to close a private deal. It's a much longer process to get public. And what you don't want to do is agree to something now that kind of hampers your ability to get your data ready and then go public and be stuck and not be able to do that. So I suppose maybe kicking on to Jennifer as to, how do we still keep planning without, running the race to go public, and make sure we don't do anything that upsets that process.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Robbie. I think obviously having your eye on the ball in terms of the underlying business being the key, because without that, none of the fundraising matters, right? Your data, your milestones are the most important bit. But just further on to what Gil said too, and I completely agree with his market assessment there, but I think in terms of IPOs, obviously it's going to make marketing a lot easier if you can give investors a more clear indication of your ultimate success, right? So like now, a biotech going public will probably be farther along than they would have been in the past couple of years, because the easier you can make that marketing on yourself, the better. And then, I think just being more thoughtful around whether, with the private markets being a bit more accessible at the moment, just whether you should do another private round ahead of an IPO, kind of how that plays into where you are in your milestones. Just giving yourself the most flexibility there was, as Robbie was saying too, it used to be like, okay, when you wanted to go public, you could be there in 6 months' time, but now you need to make sure you have the flexibility in case that takes longer, even if you are completely ready to hit the ground running with your financial statements and all the other requirements for an IPO. And then once you are public too, just as Gil said, like there's not necessarily the optionality that there was previously. So, and in terms of deal structuring and terms being a lot less favorable. Follow-on offerings, the terms have been a lot less favorable so far this year. So I think you're seeing more of like the ATM programs and those sorts of things being used when the follow-on market's just not what it was.
Thanks, Robbie. Jenna, that's super. Question for you, Gil, then. Obviously, the markets, it's a lot harder clearly to get a deal done, private, public. Just want to talk about sort of financing alternatives. You're struggling to get a round away or waiting on a milestone or a readout that's coming. What other financing alternatives exist at present, if any? And how's this changed in the sort of last 6 months? What other options are available?
Yeah, so not too many. Well, it really depends on the stage of development. I think from the standpoint of, if you're in late stage and you need phase 3 capital, there are certain firms that are highly selective and they look for a very low risk profile, i.e. your phase 2B needs to be extremely strong. and they need to be able to take a good view on the phase 3 and the commercial ability of the asset, either by you or that it would be attractive to a big pharma. Those can be financed in such a way where you essentially, let's say you get $100 million and you need to pay those investors back 1.2, 1.3 times their money, potentially, right? Depending on how long it takes to get the overall result. So if you look at the 100 million, you'll need to pay them, 100 back, and then there'll be some milestones and royalties that you'll get. It's kind of a hybrid debt product. Depending on how early the stage of development is, depending on how risky the program is, it could be 3 times their money. So for the 100 million that they invest, they may require, 250, 300 million in overall return, which is not going to be all bullet when you get the data, but again, a milestone, approval, and then, pretty significant royalty stack on the overall asset. So that's one way you can think about a non-dilutive, let's call it clinical financing. The other option is to actually sell a future royalty stack in the actual asset. Unfortunately, most of the royalty companies don't participate in situations and take clinical risk. So that doesn't really provide that option. There are a number of debt providers in Europe, whether that's the EIB or local funds that can provide you some kind of debt, or the Oxford Finances, the Oberlands of the world that'll provide you some kind of 20 to 40 to $50 million venture debt at anywhere between, let's say, 12 to 14% interest. That's another way to think about non-dilutive financing. And then obviously business development. I think the hard part is, we've been preaching for quite some time that an IPOable company, a saleable company in the future, is one that writes its own ticket. So if you've been spending all this time holding on to the global rights of your asset only to create a multi-billion-dollar company, to go ahead and out-license that at phase 2 and become a royalty collector, you're going to need to start focusing on the next asset that's unencumbered in your discussions with investors, because a royalty-bearing asset in phase 2, even when you get approved and you get that milestone, if you're taking 10 to 20% royalties, it's going to take some time for that asset to become, let's say, a 500 to $1 billion asset before you can start to see some real revenues start to trickle in. So historically, that kind of revenue royalty model has not been super attractive to institutional investors, because you remove your M&A optionality. Nobody's going to buy a royalty stream when they can't extract the synergies by killing all of your sales force, taking the product and putting it into their nephrology sales force, for example, something along those lines. So I think those are 3 ways to think about it: the debt, the clinical financing, the royalty-based financing, the partnerships. And then again, I think what a lot of folks are evaluating now as well is there a scenario where 1 + 1 = 3, and together the combined companies can go ahead and find a pipe at some level of value? I think that's a harder story to sell, and there needs to be some real synergies that you can extract from there, because taking 2 biotech companies that are both burning $50 million a year, that each one of them is focused on a single product, sure, pro forma, you've got 2 assets, you're twice as diversified as you were before, but now you've got twice the burn. So if both companies were having a hard time and struggling financing, just putting those 2 companies together, maybe 1 CEO, 1 CFO, a couple of regulatory folks, you're not going to find more than $5-6 million of overall synergy. So unless you're going to cut 1 program or a couple of programs and reallocate capital someplace else, it becomes really difficult in that overall environment, unless there's a really good asset. Maybe the CEO has lost credibility. Maybe this other company has great credibility and that CEO has great access to capital. That may present an opportunity to still finance the program with equity, but unfortunately, not necessarily the same place. What we are seeing a lot, though, today is a bit of a realization, I'd say, Ross, where institutional investors have looked around. I think folks have identified where they want to make their investments, and there's a certain amount of investors that are still working. I'd say that as folks are starting to come forward, it's probably the most aggressive buyer's market that I've seen in quite some time. So we are seeing situations where 50 million market cap companies are raising $100 million, right? Where you see $80 million market cap companies raising 130, and a complete recap of the entire business. So I think, that market still exists in the follow-on market. Hopefully that'll buoy some of these more wounded companies to come up and open up the rest of the market. But outside of those few non-dilutive financing situations, a few of them, which frankly, put the company back quite a step, right? Especially if you're thinking about partnering out. Those are really the only other options for companies today in a non-dilutive manner.
I mean, the only other, I mean, just I suppose on that theme, Gil, Ross, I mean, I think the other thing we've been seeing is there are, in a way, there are some less prudent companies sitting on balance sheets with greater amounts of capital, and there are more prudent companies who are not, but who may well have a more developed asset, or even an asset with better clinical data, even at the phase 2 level. And what you are seeing is, at least it's still very early stages at the moment, but we are seeing investors connecting companies and saying, you know, we think it'd be wise for you to take your combined capital and deploy it on this asset. You get to keep the other ones, but they get mothballed to an extent. And then you focus your time and effort, in particular, where you're in kind of competing or complementary product lines. You know, I mean, how many oncology biotechs got IPO'd? I mean, like there is not a market for all of those to be a success, however much people might pretend. So there is a way that I think people can, M&A to an extent, can drive efficiency in the allocation of the capital that is out there. And I think that is something that, look, as I have an M&A practice as well, clearly good for me, but I think it is a positive outcome, both in the private market as well as between kind of biotech companies that IPO'd, to use that, you know, rather than, you know, have 100 products that only get 2/3 of the way down the regulatory pathway. It's a much better outcome for everybody if you have 50 products that make it.
And I guess, you know, a key point there, obviously, investors connecting and you know, the importance there of making sure you get the right investors on the cap table, investors on the cap table for life, and the investors that are obviously going to add value in the geographies that you're working in. In terms of, I mean, Gil, I mean, I'll ask the question on this front now. I mean, because we always see it, a SPAC still, we've seen a couple announced. We've seen, I mean, do you see SPACs as a viable option long term? Are we going to see biotechs looking at that if they're looking at the public markets, or is that phase something that we're not going to see as much now?
Yeah, I think that market's really iced a little bit. Right. I think, unfortunately, the performance has been really, really lackluster. Outside of a few situations, there has been, you know, really poor performance, and I think some of that is because of the SPAC ARB investors that have been playing games. Some of that is because of poor performance of some of the post-SPAC companies, and some of that is just broad general overall market, right? So I think it, you know, where you look back 24 months ago, you're a SPAC banker and kind of the renaissance that you would never see this kind of volume ever again. I think it's gone again 180 degrees where there's absolutely zero volume. The biggest issue is that, you know, the SPAC market became really prolific because institutional investors, with interest rates being so low, would rather put 10 million bucks here, and here at these different SPACs than put the money in the bank. And at the end of the day, if I like the story, I'll go ahead and vote for it. I'll get my shares. If not, I'll get my money back, right? So it was a good way to kind of park your money. And a lot of the healthcare specialists put up their own SPACs and tried to execute such. When the market started to go south, a lot of the healthcare specialists took their money out of the SPACs that they had invested, and now a lot of those SPACs are owned by kind of your traditional, you know, arbitrage SPAC investors, which, you know, sometimes those guys could care less what the overall transaction is, what the name of the company is, what the company does. All I know is that if it's 10:02, I'll vote for the deal and I'll sell the stock and make 2 cents. If it's 9:98, I'll vote against the deal and I'll get my 10 bucks back. Right. And I think, you know, in terms of how those guys operate, it's not very helpful, especially when you're looking for $150 million that exists there in trust. So today's SPACs need to assume that all of that money that exists in trust is unreliable. You may get up to 95 to 100% redemptions. And we've seen that in a number of cases. So as long as you can come to the market with a pipe with either your existing investors and maybe a couple of additional investors that tells the market, yes, I've got plenty of money to get myself to this catalyst and then some with this overall pipe. If we have redemptions at 100%, so what? The deal closes when I get my 75 million from this pipe, and that's all the money that I need. Those deals can certainly happen. I think the pipe market is certainly not so functional. So if you're showing up to the deal with all of your existing investors and you feel that the sponsors that are there are also going to participate in the pipe, and you're okay not to get any money from the trust, and this is a good going public transaction, and at the end of the day, you'll have, you know, a liquid platform, this might be an option still, right? I think they'll be few and far between. We're working with a few. It's hard, I think, to get across the goal line because of the bad rap that a lot of these SPACs have had. That being said, I have a few still in execution that should be hopefully getting across the goal line. And I think that it could exist for, you know, certain situations like where we are today, where there is no crossover market, there is no IPO market, but this may represent an intermediary step where you have a hybrid valuation of private and public. And that's, I think, what you saw in some of the earlier SPACs. If you were going to do a crossover, it'd be 200. If you were going to do an IPO, maybe it'd be 300. Let's go ahead and give you 250 in the SPAC and kind of bridge that dilution, but get you public in kind of one step crossover and IPO at once. I still think it's a good opportunity. I think the problem is that the trading dynamics have been really, really challenged with a lot of these, you know, SPAC quick money investors, which make it really, really challenging for any new investors to come in there because of the aftermarket performance, right? Especially in today's market, you're not going to buy a lot of stock in the open market or in any deals. And if you are, you want to make sure that there's a very good chance that the stock will trade up, right? So if you've got an oversubscribed deal, you feel pretty good about it. A banker comes to you and says, oh, the SPAC's looking great. Irrespective of how strong the overall demand is, you may not necessarily get some good trading. You find your stock at $5 pretty soon after the $10 share. So I think it's going to be challenged for quite some time, and you're not going to see too many new issuances. And hopefully a few of these guys will be able to get some over the goal line and have some good performance, maybe open up that asset class back, because I felt when it was functional, it provided a really nice opportunity for not only institutional investors, but also for issuers to, again, find that kind of hybrid valuation, which sometimes was really the hurdle in terms of crossovers and IPOs the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think SPACs are, I think, functionally a useful tool. They just got totally abused. And I think the economics got so out of whack for the sponsors that, you know, fine, when you're raising $500 million, $20 million worth of cash dilution is like kind of whatever. But, you know, when suddenly you're raising 100 and your fees are off the scale and you're getting huge dilution from the sponsor who's not really bringing anything, everyone was like, this sucks, right? Yeah. So I think the question was like, what were all these SPACs going to do? What was on the Q&A? I think the answer is there's going to be an absolute begging frenzy coming in about 6 months, probably January next year. All these SPACs are like, you know, the sponsors are going, I've actually put some money in here, and, you know, because they have to invest a bit up front, and I'm going to lose it all if I don't do something. So they're going to be working super hard to get some kind of commitments from their existing trust investors not to redeem. They're going to have to slash what their economic entitlement is to the bone, probably more than they would do in the regular downturn. And there will be some, because, you know, as Jenna will say, there's been very, very few. Yes, there was a load of IPOs last year. There's just been very, very few this year. But the companies are still there, and they're still being developed, and they're still ready for that next stage at some point. So there's going to have to be a bit of a catch up, I think. Yeah,
maybe. No, fully agree, Robbie. And the next question I see in the Q&A, any predictions on when the IPO market may open up? I mean, I'm probably on the optimistic side as well, but I think now there's so much uncertainty, right? Like, it's not just biotechs, it's across the board. It's you know, everybody's trying to get a handle on how you price in everything happening in Ukraine, inflation, like still getting over COVID, the shutdowns in China. There's just so much uncertainty that nobody can quite get their arms fully around that yet. So I think for a while, at the beginning of this year, you know, things were choppy before all of those other uncertainties hit. But I think for a while, everyone was optimistic about summer potentially being the window. And then clearly that's kind of shifted. And I think now sentiment is probably mixed as to whether there'll be an autumn window. But if not, you know, early next year, I think is a very, very real possibility. I think those of us who work on this side are getting a bit nervous because, as Robbie said, the companies are still there. The pipeline is still growing. the backlog on my desk is just piling up. So I think when the floodgates open, it will indeed be a flood.
Yeah, I'm a bit more bearish, Jen. I think, my economist put out a note earlier this week. She sees 3 additional rate hikes and a recession that kind of bottoms out in the third quarter of next year, which takes us, pretty far into, when are these markets going to open up in a robust style? I don't think that the markets are closed per se. I think the public markets for IPOs can still happen if you want to do a club deal. There's just not a lot of extra investors coming around there. Until that opens up, the private market for pre-IPOs is going to be shut. But there are ways, and I think we've proven it over the last couple of weeks, where we can certainly get transactions done for our clients. It's just a buyer's market out there. So what used to be a $1 billion company and is now a $200 million company, if somebody's going to offer you $100 million to stay alive and keep breathing, take the deal and move on. Nobody remembers where you raised money. They'll all remember where you sold a company. So I can't tell you how many times companies go out at 16, they raise money at 20, they raise money at 25, then all of a sudden they raise money at 12. Maybe they raise money at 6, and then they sell the company for $45. And nobody remembers any of that interstage stuff, just kind of where the final deal got across the goal line. So dilution is a bad word in Europe, unfortunately, in some categories. It really shouldn't be. When you're a growth story, you got to fund the company. You got to fund the company appropriately and efficiently to move it forward. And I think there are investors that are open for business. It's just they've got their pick of the litter with respect to attractive valuations. And if you're waiting for a massive catalyst in data to either move the stock or enhance your valuation as a private company to go to investors, do not expect them to move too much. In fact, often these days, you announce good data as a public company, your stock will go down around 20%. So those are situations which, I think are very difficult to digest, right? You should assume when you create value and you cure some patients and you have some good results, unfortunately the market's not behaving very efficiently. And there's still about a lot of noise out there. So I think it's going to take a bit of time. What could really turn this around and make me a little bit more bullish? That, obviously that's always the next question. I think a couple of M&A transactions where you have a significant amount of the shareholders who are, let's say, some of the more beaten up hedge funds and healthcare specialists. So some of the most prolific investors in biotech are off anywhere between 30 or 40% this year, all in. And until there's an M&A transaction which has all of them in the top 10 shareholders and that capital gets returned to them, it's hard for them to actually deploy any new capital. So transactions like that, positive data that also pushes some of those stocks back into the stratosphere, I think all would be welcome in terms of establishing that velocity of capital. But outside of that, a Biohaven is certainly nice, but there weren't too many specialists who own that stock, right? Great data and M&A could certainly accelerate that. But when I first started in this business in kind of 2001, as a very young banker, I didn't execute my first key deal for about 30 months on the back of kind of that 01, 02 explosion in tech, which impacted, a significant amount of the space. So we've seen these ice cold windows in the past. I think these are the times where you just got to put your head down, try to meet with as many investors as you can, and continue to push the ball forward and really focus on the strength of your existing investors and make sure they realize that, it's going to be them that's most likely going to be funding the company in the late stage development pre-IPO until these markets do open up. So Jennifer, I would love to see it early next year as well. But unfortunately, I think it may be a little bit more rocky than we hope.
We'll reconvene next year, see how we get on.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe a question for Hsin, because I know that you mentioned Biohaven, and there's been a couple of other sort of big pharma biotech M&A deals going on, and I noted from the OMass announcement that you had Sanofi in there, Sanofi Ventures, and I know some of the big pharma venture sort of captive venture funds treat venture investing under different ways. Is it the Trojan horse, or is it just we want to see what the science is, or we're actually just actively seeking a return? And I wondered how you balanced, they're a great, investor to have, clearly. How did you balance that with the kind of desire, I suppose, to keep your options open for the future?
Yeah, I guess the venture arm of Sanofi is certainly very independent from Sanofi, the pharmaceutical. So I don't think there's kind of conflict, and certainly all those discussions clearly were also had to make sure that we gave ourselves the most flexibility in terms of the future. I think for us it was more the strategic alignment of what we wanted to achieve as a company and what our investors wanted to achieve, and that was very good alignment with Sanofi Ventures in terms of an investor. It doesn't bear any sort of limitations in terms of what we can do. So there's no restrictions, and that's often the case, right? There's sort of arm's length between the venture arm and the corporate pharma arm, for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's sometimes your corporate investors can be a bit more heavy-handed, seeking various exit restrictions, and I've seen kind of weird examples where a company's had to IPO just to avoid some kind of sale restriction, but then ultimately just IPO and get sold, which is highly inefficient. But
no, I think that's strategic alignment in terms of getting the best for the company, the assets, and the patients. There's certainly good strategic alignment, and we don't have any concerns or restrictions around that. But getting that strategic alignment is important, and that's what takes time.
I mean, it's obviously important to make sure how targeted you are around your investors, and how you're how you're working through that in terms of alignment with the business. I guess if some companies that are in a different, I guess, sort of state, maybe they can't be as selective, right, Robbie? And that's where you end up with maybe a partner that isn't as aligned, and you end up with other strategic goals. But obviously, participants, if anyone wants to ask any questions, the Q&A is open. I've seen we've answered most of them. There's a question here which I'll put to the panel. What's the panel view on cannabis biotech companies? Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, look, I think it's kind of slightly different, because most CBD products are not actually biotechs. They're like a consumer healthcare thing, which is why they have to back out any of the more pharmaceutical focused parts to it. I mean, I know Jen has actually kind of on a similar related but totally separate topic has IPO'd a number of the kind of psychedelics companies, and how they kind of rehabilitated or trying to rehabilitate the reputation of psilocybin and as a pharmaceutical product. Maybe pass to her on that.
Yeah, it's been interesting in that respect of kind of having to do a bit more investor education around all of that, rather than just having folks, go with their instinct of what the societal connotations that go with those sorts of terms. And I think cannabis companies, I'm sure, have the same hurdle to clear. But yeah, I haven't personally done any cannabis deals, so I can't speak to that specifically.
Yeah, I'd say, listen, in cannabis, it is more of a consumer play. I think the big issue when you think about it, like a GW Pharma, it becomes more of a pharmaceutical product and an API discussion, and a much more extensive clinical trial cost to get said drug onto the market for said indication. Just a 10-patient study of people taking this marijuana edible and what their overall result is in an uncontrolled fashion, that's not going to get you the label that you need to get the drugs marketed by the FDA at the right pricing. So, a traditional cannabis company is really not really a pharma company. So you got to make that distinction. I think on the psychedelics also, the same issue exists as it does with the cannabis, is that there are a number of funds, some of the mutual funds in particular, that are not allowed to invest in things that are criminalized in the US. And while, yes, cannabis may be legal in Massachusetts, it's still federally not allowed. So from the standpoint of bank financing or having a number of these companies get traditional investors who have yet to cross that hurdle into the world of, scheduled narcotic, so to speak. Until that happens, it's going to be very, very difficult for that whole market, I think, to explode. That being said, I think, the Compass IPO was anchored by a number of specialists, and those guys have real data, right, in terms of treatment-resistant depression and using the active ingredient in magic mushrooms to help patients. There's a number of other studies that are ongoing. So I think that's a really good option for patients, and could, have a number of investors that get excited about it, but it's going to take some time for both of those markets to mature.
Good stuff. Thank you. Just looking at the Q&A, another question about if we were looking to build a company in the interim, I guess, whilst the markets are, not performing fantastically, what would you be focusing on? Data, partnerships, infrastructure, IPO readiness. Yeah. Any views in terms of how people should be looking at structuring their company? Obviously, data super important in terms of what's happening. I'd guess first and foremost, but any other advice in terms of if a company's getting organized?
Yeah, I think one, you need to be open-minded to think about, is there a combination that makes sense if I can't go ahead and finance the company, if I don't have existing shareholders that are going to go ahead and support me. But also, as you're designing your clinical studies, try to do it in a way that, one, you can get real meaningful controlled data as soon as possible, and don't cut corners, because if you show up with 10 patients in an open label study that's a combination, it's going to fall flat. Yes, sometimes it's good to have combination studies, but try to establish monotherapy efficacy for your drug. Try to do it in as much of a controlled fashion as you can, with a placebo in a randomized fashion, a real proper phase 2, because historically, 20 patients in an open label study, if 15 of them reacted, they used to be good, right? Investors, you used to be able to finance on the back of that. Today, they'll find holes in every piece of data. So try to make the data as robust as possible, as clear as possible, and a clinically meaningful outcome that is really, really clear. Now, there's always some kind of shade of gray, and it's never that easy, but try to design your trials in such a way that you can actually see some data in advance, and you don't have to wait 3 years, to get the overall results. The joke is, let's go ahead and do an anti-aging study. It's going to cost me about $1 billion, and I'll have the data for you in about 30 years to see, which patients, right? Nobody will invest in that kind of a study because of the time frame. So you need to think about, how do I get meaningful data, and how do I get it in a relatively short period of time? That's what's going to really attract investors.
Thanks, Gil.
I think the only thing that I would add is, you don't necessarily, look, planning for an IPO takes time, but you don't want to be spending your money, the scarce capital that you have, on that, because you don't know what's going to happen. I would just say, be mindful about what you do to make sure it doesn't make anything in the future more complicated. So, if you have to do an option scheme to keep people involved, make sure it's actually workable and understandable to investors, or compatible with an IPO. It doesn't need to be anything super complicated, but you can make it is easy to try and cut a corner there and make a terrible mistake, which either trashes the economics of the options for the people who hold it, or make it very, very difficult to convert into a kind of public, or an option for public security. So it's more like, just try not to do anything that makes your life harder in the future, would be my simplistic advice, I suppose.
I was maybe I'll just add the sort of opposite side of not making your life more difficult is actually to, in addition to, I guess, keeping the company running as efficiently as possible and collecting as much value adding data as possible, is to the prep that can go on behind the scenes. Getting a very clear narrative, getting your corporate deck ready. And I think we spent a lot of time just thinking, say, for example, a contract log with every single contract you have with the company. Just creating that takes a lot of time. And we spent quite a few months just making sure that all that kind of paperwork, it's all ready to go when investors are interested, right? Every program had papers ready to go with the scientific due diligence, all the background about the target, all the data we have, everything's referenced, ready to go into the due diligence platform, all our employment contracts, all our share option documents, all that kind of stuff can be done so that when you have the right person interested, they can see everything as they want it as efficiently as possible. So all that kind of is really good use of time.
Thanks, Hsin. I guess that comes down to whether you're fundraising or you're on a pathway to IPO. It's about preparation, right? And it's about having that state and I guess more so historically where we're seeing more preemptive approaches as well. It's about being in that state of deal readiness. Another question in the Q&A, what is the panel's view on real-world data as a means of accelerating biotech, e.g. drug development and de-risking investment? Anyone have any views on that?
Ross, what was the first part of the question?
It was, what's the panel's view on real-world data as a means of accelerating biotech, e.g. drug development and de-risking investment?
Real world data in terms of a natural history.
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I listen, I think it's helpful to have that and to understand the progression of the disease. But any type of historical context, any type of natural history data, again, in an uncontrolled fashion, it's going to fall flat in this market. Again, historically, in the most rosiest of markets, I could come and say, oh, I did this open label study, and last time people did an experiment 5 years ago that looked like this, my data looks a lot better. Today, nobody's going to really, give you any credit for that unless it's a head-to-head study, right? Because, so it's real world data is helpful, but only to a certain degree. You're not going to get a ton of value outside of a purely controlled clinical status or a clinical experiment in this market, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think there's still value in the kind of from a candidate selection criteria to use to find a way to, there's lots of AI drug discovery businesses that are using scientific and legacy scientific data to try and understand how diseases develop and what's worked in the past and to come up with new candidates. And that's clearly going to be of some benefit just from a simple cost saving perspective. But again, those investments take time because people need to actually see, the route to market has been shortened because of the use of their technology, and that will always just take time.
Thanks, Robbie. I'm conscious of the time. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to hand back to Josh, who I think is going to wrap things up. Big thank you to the panel. Fantastic, some great insight there. Really interesting discussion. I hope that was super useful for everyone that joined. Josh, back to you.
Fantastic, thank you, Ross. Thanks to all of our panel. So some great insight there. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the bear versus bull arguments on the IPO market from Jennifer and Gil moving forward. Lots of great insight there. As I said, thank you all for joining us today. I think this sort of conversation and discussion is one that's going to rage on certainly for the next few months. So a big thank you also to Ross and DFIN for hosting this webinar today, and I'm sure very happy to discuss how they might be able to help you, as with all of our panelists, moving forward. If you have any questions, we will be sending out a recording of the video for all of those on the session today, and for all those who may have missed the session. So that'll come through, and if you have any follow-up you want to make to any of the panel, please do respond to that, and we can make those introductions across. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, this is sort of in the run-up to our Investable Showcase in partnership with Jefferies and the Jefferies Healthcare Conference in November. I hope we'll be able to see many of you there. But for now, thanks again for joining, and hope to see you again very soon, whether virtually or in person.